Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk WEM, Season 2. I'm delighted you're joining us. Over the season, we're getting into the detail behind some of the really big issues that are critical to the way that we manage our water and more broadly our environment. We're speaking to leading figures in the environmental sector around the world and practitioners, including many CIWEM members, who are making a difference every day through their work. We're really grateful to our series sponsor, Thames Water, whose support means that we can share these conversations with you. I'm Niki Roach. I'm the President of CIWEM, which is the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. And I think one of CIWEM's real strengths is the breadth of the topics that our members have expertise in and the depth of that expertise that they have. And we'll be shining a light on both of those across this series. The theme of my presidency is Everything is Connected. And I hope through this podcast and across the rest of the season, you'll spot the links, environmental, social, maybe even personal, between the topics that we're covering and how they might relate to you. So in today's episode, we're talking about COP, but possibly not the COP you might expect. This episode is all about COP15. We've got a fantastic interview coming up with Craig Bennett, and to explain more about COP15 and share his expert opinions, I'm joined by another fantastic co-host, Richard Benwell. Welcome, Richard. I'm really pleased you can join us for this one.
Hi, Nikki. Thanks for having me.
Richard is the Chief Executive of Wildlife and Countryside Link, and previously he's been a policy advisor to the Secretary of State at DEFRA, worked on policy and advocacy at the World Wildlife Trust and the RSPB, and served as a director of Westmill Solar Cooperative and a clerk in the House of Commons Commission. Every time I see you over video calls, you're usually outside, so I feel terrible to have dragged you inside to record this podcast, Richard.
Any excuse, I'll be in the garden, so maybe next time we can have some twittering in the background.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. So as usual, Richard and I are going to listen to our guest interview together and then we'll discuss his reflections. Our guest interview today is with Craig Bennett. Craig's the CEO of the Wildlife Trusts and he's previously been described by The Guardian as one of the UK's top environmental campaigners. Before joining the Wildlife Trust, he was CEO of Friends of the Earth and Deputy Director of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And Craig set the ambition for the Wildlife Trust for putting a third of the UK's land and sea into nature recovery by 2030. It's a really compelling interview and I was really interested to hear Craig's views on how much of our land in the UK is actually in a good state for nature.
The Prime Minister signed up to the so-called 30 by 30 commitment, pledging to have 30% of our land and sea into nature's recovery by 2030. But just the way the Prime Minister and Downing Street talked about it at the time suggests they didn't fully understand what that means. They said that the UK was currently at 26%, and they only got there by including all our national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, as if all those are in a perfect state for biodiversity at the moment. So we think at the Wildlife Trust we're closer to around 5% of our land in the UK that's actually in a good state for nature at the moment, not 26%. So there's a huge disjunct there between the rhetoric and the reality.
So Richard, before we head into our interview with Craig, can you start by telling us all what COP15 is all about and when is it happening?
COP15 is the 15th conference of the parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this is the global treaty that's intended to deal with the ecological crisis. This is the multilateral agreement that's meant to put the international law in place that will translate into action in nations across the globe to turn around the decline in biodiversity. Originally, both of the big COPs were meant to be last year in Super 2020. Then, of course, they were delayed by COVID and it became Super 2021. Now it looks like we'll have COP26, the climate COP this year, but COP15 will be delayed until 2022. So we hope it's going to be a sort of spectacular 2022 for biodiversity.
What are the connections between COP26, which is obviously the climate COP, and COP15 at a high level?
There aren't enough connections at the moment. So they're both dealing essentially with the same problem, which is our overexploitation of our natural environment. But we've got ourselves locked into this situation where we deal with climate through the UNFCCC, so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we deal with nature through the Convention on Biological Diversity. You can't fix one without fixing the other. But unfortunately, the links between the two frameworks have been tenuous at best. So we're starting to see some of the emphasis on nature-based solutions appear in the Climate Convention. So that means using nature's power to draw down carbon and lock it up in natural habitats to start to mitigate some of the greenhouse gases that we're releasing. And we're starting to see those nature-based solutions coming through to adapt to climate change as well. So that's good. But you can't see nature purely through a climate lens. We can't instrumentalise nature just to try to reduce carbon. It's got to be about turning around the biodiversity crisis at the same time as seeing off the climate crisis. More links between the two would help because both conventions have different strengths.
Let's get into it and hear from Craig. Let's start off with a really big question. What does the world need to get out of COP15?
Well, very simply, we need to turn the corner on the decline of biodiversity worldwide. I mean, we are in this climate and ecological crisis. That's a phrase we've heard quite a lot the last few years, but it couldn't be more clear from the science just how serious this is and the state that it is an emergency, and we need to start treating it like an emergency. So whereas in the past we've seen politicians come together, world leaders come together and make all kinds of promises that then they don't keep, this time round we've really got to go on an emergency footing, and we've got to sort of treat both the nature crisis through the biodiversity COP and the climate crisis through the climate COP, noting that they're both very closely related. We'll come back to that later, but we've got to treat them like emergencies and act as if that's the case. That means, yes, setting the kind of bold targets of where we need to get to as fast as possible, but then having real plan, concrete plan of how we're going to get there.
And from a UK perspective, do we feel like those plans are already starting to form, or is that something you're hoping to come out of COP?
Yeah, not really. I wouldn't say so. I mean, we've had lots of good words, lots of good rhetoric from the government over the last few years on this. We had the environment plan that says want to leave the environment in a better state for the next generation. And last September, the Prime Minister signed up to the so-called 30 by 30 commitment, which we think will get finalised at this biodiversity COP, pledging to have 30% of our land and sea into nature's recovery by 2030. But just the way the Prime Minister and Downing Street talked about it at the time suggests they didn't fully understand what that means. They said that the UK was currently at 26%, and they only got there by including all our national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, as if all those are in a perfect state for biodiversity at the moment. So we think at the Wildlife Trust we're closer to around 5% of our land in the UK that's actually in a good state for nature at the moment, not 26%. So there's a huge disjunct there between the rhetoric and the reality, and there's a huge job to do over the next 10 years, both in the UK but also globally, if we're going to stop seeing those graphs that show species in decline, species extinctions, all those things, and turn those around.
So we talked a little bit about COP26, and I guess I feel like the words climate emergency are much more well known in society, let's say, these days. And I know at CIWEM we talk about a climate and ecological, emergency as two linked but separate things. Do you think policy and things like COP15 are the best mechanism to move things forward on biodiversity?
On any of these issues, there's certainly no one silver bullet, and certainly not when it comes to policy. We need action at all levels. We need action at the sort of individual level, at the local level, community level, regional levels within countries, country level, state level, and also at global regions and globally. We need all that kind of action. And actually, if we get it right, they can all reinforce each other. Actually global agreements can help kind of give the confidence for individual states and regions and city-states and so on to be bold and move forward. Equally, if city-states and regions and countries take the lead, that's sometimes what can unlock the kind of agreement globally for us to move further and faster. So it's not an either-or. But what I would say is typically what we see with these big international meetings, on a good day, what they can do is they can raise the low bar as to where we're at. We can sort of bank the kind of agreement we've got to and get all countries to say, well, at least we're going to do this. And that clearly is a step forward. But, you never come out of one of these global meetings and think problem solved. Of course not. Actually, what you get is only the merest glimpse of, the world moving forward. That in itself is useful, but let's not think that it is the answer.
I'm keen to explore with you COP26 then, running into COP15. Obviously, the UK has got the presidency of the climate COP this year in conjunction with Italy. Do you think we being the UK, can leverage our presidency of COP26 on climate to sort of build better links and more joined up outcomes from COP15?
The important thing is in the narrative and actually how we implement sort of solutions to try and address both these crises, that's where we really need to recognise that they are inextricably linked. There are no solutions to the climate crisis that could or should be done that make the biodiversity crisis worse. That would just completely undermine action on climate, even though we see some people doing that, sometimes planting trees on peat bogs, which is a completely mad thing to do from both a climate and nature perspective, but it happens, annoyingly, because of this very siloed thinking. Equally, we've got to make sure that anything that's done to address the nature crisis obviously is in tandem with tackling the climate crisis as well. So we've got to make sure you've got that holistic thinking about joining up the two, and they really are not so much separate problems as both symptoms of the same problem, which is, as humanity, we haven't yet worked out how to live fairly within environmental limits. So that's what we've really got to be able to solve, not just addressing the symptoms of them. But to give another answer that sort of just suggests, how far off we are at the moment from really realising how serious the global ecological crisis is just how little attention there's been over the last year about how this appalling COVID-19 pandemic was almost certainly, its root causes were in the global ecological crisis. We were first being warned 25 years ago, if not before that, but certainly 25 years ago with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, said that if we continue to erode and fragment wildlife habitats around the world, particularly in the tropics, and if we continue to trade in endangered species and endangered species parts, then that would lead to future pandemics, because you have these zoonotic escapes and spillovers of diseases from wildlife populations into human populations. And so we've seen that over the last few decades. We saw that, first of all, of course, HIV/AIDS came that way, and then we've had Ebola, we've had SARS, we've had Nipah virus, and more recently we've had COVID-19. One academic wrote about a year ago that COVID-19 was, for most people, certainly in the West, in rich countries in the West, our first personal sort of impact of the global biodiversity crisis, which is an interesting way to kind of think about it. And yet, how often do you hear that in the media debate at the moment? There's perhaps been a little bit of coverage of that, but very little really. And if we think the answer to these problems is vaccines and building more hospitals, it's amazing how we do that. That's incredible, and thank goodness we've been able to develop and roll out vaccines over the last year. But it's only really treating the symptoms of the problem. If we really want to try and live fairly within environmental limits, we've got to get on with it. We've got to put nature into recovery. Otherwise, for example, we will face more pandemics in the future. And that's just one example, Niki, about how the global ecological crisis is starting to bite us back. So it's getting serious now. We've got to take this much more urgently, move a lot faster, have a very clear plan of action, not just the targets on their own. And we've got to see that kind of political leadership and weight that comes behind it.
It's really impactful, isn't it? I wonder why you think it's not been part of the dialogue, why we've not made that connection when we've been thinking about COVID in particular. Let's use that as an example.
The problem is it's not 100% clear. It might be that, COVID-19 escaped by accident from a lab. Can't rule that out. It might be that people were collecting viruses from wildlife populations like bats to study, and then it escaped, and that might be a possibility. In a funny kind of way, and what I'm about to say might sound really surprising, it doesn't actually make much difference to what I've just argued, because the fact still is really clear that the next pandemic may well come because of wildlife spillovers. So basically, irrespective of whether it was the cause of COVID-19 or not, but most scientists you talk to say almost certainly it is, even if it wasn't, we do know for certain that that is the primary cause of most global pandemics that have happened in the past and will do in the future. So bottom line, if we want to avoid more and more pandemics coming ever more frequently, we've got to stop eroding wildlife habitat. It's as simple as that. Again, I stress that's only one example about how the global biodiversity crisis is hitting us. What about the fact that we're seeing extraordinary declines in food productivity around the world? Our agriculture is essentially failing. It's propped up by fertilisers and chemicals. You take those away and the soils are exhausted, and actually it's going to take, guess what, nature to put those soils into recovery and to make sure that we have sustainable agriculture long term. What about our clean air? What about our need for clean water? In all of these cases, actually, the more that we can get nature into recovery, the better we are helping ourselves on this. And I think there has been this appalling disconnect between, the sort of politicians and realising just how serious this is. For too long, nature, certainly in rich countries, has been framed as a nice thing to go and visit at the weekend, rather than fully understanding that it totally underpins our whole civilization. You know, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, not the other way round, and yet we do treat it as it's the other way round, and the economy owns nature. Rubbish. Nature owns the economy, and we've got to start behaving like that.
This series of Let's Talk WEM is sponsored by Thames Water, and it's thanks to their support that it's possible to bring this podcast to you. If your organisation would like to find out more about sponsoring an episode in this series, or even a future series of Let's Talk WEM, just go to letstalkwem.ciwem.org to get all the information you need. That's really powerful. Yeah, nature owns the economy. I'm really interested in circular economy principles for exactly that reason. I think it feels like we need to get to crisis point with all of these challenges. With the climate crisis, you know, we're seeing horrific floods in China at the moment, and the same in Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands, and all of those things feel like only when we get to that crisis point often is when we recognise that really big things like maybe our economic systems need to change. It's kind of heartbreaking, the passion that you speak with. You just think, why can we not do more? So I guess let me turn that on its head slightly and think about, okay, we're chairing COP26, we've then got COP15. Where can the UK in particular have the most influence, do you think? And are we credible, given what you just talked about as that figure of around 5% of nature actually in good status?
We have the potential to be credible, let's put it that way. Of course, my job is always to poke government with a sharp stick and point out where it needs to do more. At least we've kind of broadly got some of the narrative right about why, you know, we need to be tackling climate. It's good that we were out there getting our targets in place, say on net zero. It's good that we're signed up to 30 by 30, at least theoretically. And that's kind of, I suppose, where you have to start. Now we need to see the very clear plans to kind of get there. And we could see that, you know. I mean, I don't hold out too much hope at the moment, but I keep pushing government to do it. The way, you know, the Olympics is opening at the moment in Tokyo, and I'd always kind of think, like, if the UK was hosting the Olympics in 2030, you know, you wouldn't just have a target, we're going to host the Olympics, and hope that somehow it happens. You'd have a clear project plan about how you're going to get there, with loads of Gantt charts and milestones, and make sure the venues get built on time, and check in 2025, are we on target, and so on. That's the approach we need for reaching our net zero targets. That's the approach we need for putting nature into recovery. If we're going to have a target to have 30% of our land and sea in recovery by 2030, but what does that mean for where we need to be by 2025? What does that mean for where we need to be by 2022? And what does that mean for what we need to do this year to kind of get there? That's the approach we need across this whole kind of area to do that. And that's what we don't see at the moment from government in a kind of joined up way. So if we saw that, then government would be more credible. What has been hugely undermined over the last year, the cut in foreign aid. You might think, well, how's that connected? But actually, the key to unlocking so much of the international agreements around climate and indeed on biodiversity, will the rich countries provide some of the finance necessary for poorer countries to move to zero emission technologies, or indeed, you know, some of the approaches needed to put biodiversity into recovery. And so the finance unlocks the key to doing that. It enables those kind of conversations, as so much else flows from that. So you cannot underestimate the extent to which the UK lost credibility through that cut to foreign aid in the negotiations for COP26, and indeed in engaging around COP15 as well. It's a real tragedy, and it is very clear to me that Boris Johnson just hadn't thought that one through. It was only £4 billion a year. The amount we're spending at the moment, all kinds of things. I mean, that's tiny money in the scheme of things. It's done irreparable damage, really, to our reputation and our credibility in a year when we're supposed to be playing the diplomatic lead on these issues. And I think there's other things as well. I mean, I don't think Brexit has helped. Brexit has been perceived internationally as the UK turning its back on the world. And I just hear that from colleagues in other countries. That is how it's perceived elsewhere, whether, you know, even if you support Brexit and say that's not what it's about, that's how it is perceived by many people in other countries. And indeed, particularly then when people in government talk about changing or amending regulations, environmental regulations. I mean, not long ago, George Eustace, Secretary of State for the Environment, announced that he was going to be reviewing the habitats regulations that once existed under the EU Habitats Directive. I find it very hard to imagine that a review of those regulations won't lead to them being watered down in some way or another. And that will be seen as a huge backward step. And and moving to a lower, a poorly regulated economy on environmental matters. So all those kind of things undermine our credibility in these international negotiations, which is a shame, because actually otherwise we'd have a half decent story to tell.
What's happening on the ground in the UK? Are you seeing any, pardon the pun, green shoots of success that are turning the tide a little? That's a lot of environmental metaphors in one sentence, forgive me.
What is exciting is that the narrative now is firmly in the place that we need to get nature into recovery. We shouldn't underestimate that. You know, for over 100 years, the conservation movement in the UK has been really focused on trying to protect the last bits of remaining nature that are left, you know, buying up bits of land for nature reserves. We ourselves at the Wildlife Trust have done it. In fact, at the Wildlife Trust, we now own more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK. In fact, 1,000 more. And we estimate that 60% of the British population live within a 3-mile walk or cycle ride of one of our nature reserves. And we're very, very proud of them. But we're the first to say that's not enough to put nature into recovery. What we now need to do is really focus on working with others in partnership and on the policy measures and the forward sort of strategic planning to join those up, join the dots between those reserves, put a nature recovery network in place, have new designations such as the one we proposed, Wild Belt, that would allow you to take land that is currently of low biodiversity value and manage it for nature's recovery. We need to be doing all those kind of things. Now we've got to move into the real policies and measures that will do that. And there's lots of good examples of it happening around the country, but you know, we haven't got it at scale yet in the way that will really make a difference. Of course, the other thing to say is around the agricultural transition. You know, I was knocking Brexit before, but the one potential silver lining is if we get really significant reforms to agricultural policy, we will end up doing a lot of things that we probably could have done under the CAP anyway, but I'm not going to start arguing in favour of the common agricultural policy. It was pretty dreadful. But actually what you're seeing at the moment, positive thinking from government about the direction of travel on agricultural policy. The Wildlife Trust and many other NGOs argued during the kind of debate on that where public money, in other words subsidies, was going to be used to support farmers, it should be to support public goods rather than those that the market can provide. So in other words, paying for environmental benefits and so on. And that argument was broadly won. So we're hoping that as the agricultural transition rolls through, that will involve farmers being supported to produce much more nature-friendly farming and produce really good quality food, but in a way that's good for putting nature into recovery and to support more regenerative farming. Again, the narrative on that is pretty decent at the moment from government, but the detail is missing again. You know, at the moment it's not clear how that's going to work. That's the problem with so much of this, Nikki, is you get the narrative's in the right place, but then you're waiting for ages for the detail and the proof that it's really going to happen.
But I suppose thinking globally, not just with a UK lens, climate feels like it's something that individuals now have some personal accountability for. People are talking about it on an individual level. CIWEM members are water and environment professionals. You know, we can wait for policy, but is there more that we can do around this beyond needing the policy levers to shift to help us?
I'm kind of waiting more for the policy and the politicians to catch up with where people are so many ways. You know, time and again now, what you see is the real leadership not coming from politicians on this, but coming from local communities, coming from a handful of land managers that are really showing the way, coming from professionals, not least many of them CIWEM members, and showing the way forward. And you see that leadership, and then you kind of think, right, now let's have the politicians and the policy please catch up and make that happen everywhere. And I see it time and again. I mean, for example, I'm talking to you now from Cambridge, where I live, and just on the outskirts of Cambridge, there is a wonderful example called Trumpington Meadows of a partnership that was done between a housing developer and the local wildlife trust here around the time of building new houses about 20 years ago, set aside a nice chunk of land for a new nature reserve. And it was just before that was basically arable land, and they set that aside, and that's now being managed by the Wildlife Trust, and it's now one of the most visited nature reserves in Cambridge. But, you know, 20 years ago it wasn't there. That's really exciting. That's really powerful. If you see catchment management solutions that are being put in place by some of the water companies now to really try and address pollution at source and to try and use nature-based solutions to tackle with some of our environmental problems or indeed flooding and so on, That's really exciting. And if you see what many companies are doing on the climate, with even like Microsoft pledging to go not just net zero, but net negative by 2030, drawing down their historic emissions. If you look at the huge work being done by a whole range of companies in this whole kind of area, that's very exciting. I mean, another area of excitement is of course, around cities. Actually, the leadership we're seeing on this debate, some of the most exciting leadership, it has been from cities and city regions over the last 20 years, actually. And, initiatives like the C40 that brings together some of the world's largest cities to kind of club together on driving forward more climate-friendly policies has been really, really powerful. So you see this at all kinds of kind of levels. It just feels to me like we could move so much faster if we kind of really treated it like an emergency, if we took those leading examples, which are so powerful and so exciting, and moved quickly to scale them up, rather than remaining as just interesting but rare case studies.
Speed is of the essence here, I think, is what I've heard you say, and it's not all about politicians and policies, although those moving faster would help, but actually joining the dots a little more. And I would say this because I harp on about feeling like everything is connected, but I feel like what you've talked about today is just an exemplar of that, and the importance of not treating climate and nature as two separate things, but really looking for the opportunities for the win-wins by tackling them both, really. It has been a total joy to talk to you this morning. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Is there one final takeaway that you'd like listeners to reflect on before we close out?
Yeah, absolutely. We talked in this podcast recording a little bit about the pandemic. We talked about climate and nature and just how serious that is. It's been such an awful time this last 18 months in so many ways. But, there is a very important positive lesson we need to learn from this period as well, which is we can, as humanity, do amazing things when we put our mind to it. This time last year even, I think, perhaps a bit before this, we didn't think we could create vaccines in a period of months and roll them out rather than years or decades. We didn't think we could build hospitals in a period of weeks and months and roll them out. Everyone said, no, can't be done. We don't know what we're capable of until we really put our minds to it. And I think if we start treating the climate emergency and nature emergency as that's what they are, we will surprise ourselves with how quickly we can turn things around. We don't know how fast we can get to net zero yet. There's all these rubbish cost curves that try and tell us how slow we can get there. No, we don't know how fast we can get there until we really try, and then we innovate and find that there's ways we could never have really dreamt of. If we get serious about it, I am convinced that we will move faster on tackling the climate emergency and the nature emergency than we ever dreamt was possible. We've just got to get ourselves collectively as humanity into that mindset, get that determination there, get the grit between our teeth, make it happen. And guess what? When we do, it's a much better world as well.
So, Richard, what are your initial reflections on that interview with Craig?
Craig's absolutely right that at this stage we've got to turn from big pronouncements to implementation. This is hopefully going to be a time when the world agrees that by 2030 we're finally going to bend that curve of loss in biodiversity, and that will feel momentous. For some young people listening to this show, they might think, we've done it, we've fixed it, we've got the agreement in place. But for those who are a little longer in the tooth, you might remember that this isn't just the second time we've made this kind of agreement, it's the third time that the world has come together and essentially agreed to halt biodiversity loss. And we missed the last target to do that in spectacular style. Almost all of the HE targets, the last round of targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity, were missed. So what's got to be the difference this time? We've got to learn from some of those tricks in the Climate Convention, which are making sure that the targets we set are smart, so they're specific and measurable and time-bound, and we need to make sure that there is a clear line of sight between those overarching targets and delivery requirements and accountability for specific countries. That's the thing that Craig was picking out, and that's the thing that will make a difference this time. Ultimately, we need to see those multilateral objectives that come from the treaty translated into national law so that we can hold each government to account for actually making the difference this time.
So practically, what are some of those targets? What's on the table for COP15?
The last negotiating text, unfortunately, has taken a step backwards, in fact. So we've seen two texts so far of the CBD. There was a zero draft last year, and now we have a first draft text. In the zero draft, there was a really helpful section that set out a plan for a measurable increase in species abundance by 2030. So in other words, how much wildlife is there now? How much percentage do we want to increase it by 2030? A sort of index of progress. That's missing from the latest text, and that's something that urgently needs to be turned round so that that pinnacle objective of making sure that our species are more diverse, more abundant than they are now, that pinnacle objective needs to be as measurable and precise as possible. So we need countries like the UK that have the potential and the opportunity now to set that kind of leadership in the Environment Bill. We need those countries to come to the table and say, without that kind of specific objective, we're not going to win this. And then the other big one that Craig mentioned is 30 by 30. So this is the promise to protect 30% of our land and sea for nature by 2030. That is in the text and it's looking really good. It needs to be firmed up. But on this one, there's another role for national governments to show what it actually means on the ground. And as Craig said, there's some pretty creative accounting going on by the government at the moment to suggest that it's getting towards 30% by including some designations that have very little to do with nature. They're landscape designations. So we need to see national governments step up and make sure that they're talking about only land that's genuinely protected and managed for nature.
What level of confidence do you have that here in the UK, for example, we stand a chance of taking the steps that are required?
It's tremendously difficult. So there's always a sort of cat and mouse between international objectives and national goals and which one's going to drive the other forward. And it's kind of 1 inch forward, 1 inch forward, and they drive each other. So a lot will depend on how brave countries like ours are in advance of them. And then a lot after the talks will depend on how successful that treaty has been. So if we can get a really strong and clear target in the treaty, that will give us as conservationists something to grasp hold of for the decade ahead to make sure that the government has no choice but to do the right thing on 30 by 30. And if it works well, if it's as strong as the climate change agreements have been in the past at moments like Kyoto that really capture the public imagination, that's what will make sure that the private sector and NGOs and concerned citizens can all grasp hold of it and say, government, you're talking about 30 by 30, but really you're pulling the wool over, aren't you? Let's see some proper site designations going on. And we know it can be done. In the UK, we've only started to designate the tip of the iceberg of important areas for nature and important areas for nature recovery. So if we get this deal right, we can use it as the leverage we need to get action on the ground in the UK.
And through your role with Wildlife and Countryside Link, Richard, is there an international angle here? Because we've heard a lot about the UK perspective and what we can do. Craig touched on the importance of finance, I think, particularly supporting economies around the world that might find taking some of these steps much harder. What does the international perspective look like for COP15?
Nature doesn't come in handy nation-sized bundles, does it? I mean, anybody who's been enjoying the arrival and the departure of the swifts this summer, and anybody who appreciates the movements of species, flow of the currents of our seas, and the interdependence of every corner of nature around the world knows that you can't do this as a single country. And trying to close ourselves off and say we're going to make the nature in England better without considering our place in the world is just bonkers. So we've got to make sure that the eyes of our politicians are lifted beyond the horizon of the White Cliffs of Dover, and we remember that we've got to look after nature globally. And what does that mean practically? With things like food and farming, we can't simply ratchet up standards here in a way that then exports harm abroad because we're bringing in products that are produced to lower standards from other countries. We've got to make sure that we project those standards around the world, and crucially, that we help other countries through to make the transition. So Craig talked really compellingly about finance, and he's absolutely right. There is a huge social and ethical angle to this. If we're asking people to change the way they produce their food, we're asking them to change their livelihoods, and we're asking them to do it for all of us. So it's right that we provide financial, in-kind and intellectual support as well as political support to help make that transition in a way that's fair and just all around the world.
I hear a lot about COP26 and I hear less about COP15. Do you think people are aware of COP15, or is all the focus on COP26?
It's great that COP26 is so prominent in the public consciousness. I mean, climate change is the biggest threat to nature. It's the biggest threat to us all as a species, probably. We've got to solve climate change if we want to help nature. But the two treaties were born in the same moment. They were born in that fantastic crucible of environmental creativity at the Earth Convention in Rio back in 1992. And since then, unfortunately, their paths have sort of diverged. One's raised in prominence and in specificity and in the power of its legal machinery to change things within national jurisdictions. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it, really? Reaching into different nation states to change the way we produce our energy and heat our homes and all those things. So COP has gone to this, COP26 has reached this ascendancy. COP15 has pottered along in the way of so many other multilateral environmental agreements that it doesn't really have those grappling hooks to reach into the nation states to change things along the way. Part of that's about the formal processes of the treaty, part of it's around public prominence. And it's our job to raise it up the flagpole now and make people realise that the two are inseparable. So we've got to get that same level of public consciousness for COP15 as we have for COP26.
What does this mean for professionals and individuals? How do we stop planting trees on peat bogs, for example? What are the practical steps that might come out of COP15?
Let's scare everybody. If we get it right, it's got to mean transformative change. I mean, let's face it, nature crisis is far more complicated than the climate crisis in many ways. You can't get as much of the way with nature as we have on climate by just changing one sector, the energy sector. To achieve a turnaround in the state of nature and create a society that works in harmony with the natural environment, we've got to change almost every sector of society. So the way we measure our progress, the way we build and heat and manage our homes, the way we farm, it goes to every corner of our lives. So if we get this right, and it's translated down into a national target in the Environment Bill to halt the decline of biodiversity by 2030, then what it will mean is more obligations on more sectors to play their part in investing in nature and reducing the harm they cause to nature currently. And that shouldn't be too terrifying a thing, as long as it's a level playing field and we have the expectations right. Ultimately, it's good for business. For those brave souls who've delved into Das Gupta's report on the economics of biodiversity, it's the same message as we always give for climate. More delay means more cost ultimately. If we get the framework in place now and trace a path for business to change, then it will mean transformation, but it will be managed and it will ultimately be good for business. As for folk, as for you and me, hopefully it will help to empower those people who are already doing amazing things to spread their message further. And those warriors who've already ditched the plastic in their shampoo and their soap and have already moved to their bamboo toothbrush, that will become the norm, not the exception. Sort of matter of social conscience and normalisation of a new way of life for us all that works in harmony with the planet.
Making it easy for people is key as well, though, isn't it? A natural choice because it's a better way of doing things and it's an easier way of doing things and that people do it by default. So what's the one big takeaway from what you've heard from Craig and your reflections on COP15 that you'd like listeners to hear?
Feel part of it, I think. Craig expressed brilliantly how the action at a national level is deeply integrated with international goals. And when we talk about these COPs, they can feel so abstract and so distant, especially COP15, which is going to be in China. It's literally the world away from us here. But the things we do here in the UK now could help to determine whether that treaty is a success and could help to set the pathway for all of our lives for a long time to come. So what should we do? Well, for individuals, keep demonstrating that best practice, keep showing that we demand change. And for businesses and individuals, let the government know that if it goes to the table in COP15 with a world-leading proposition in the Environment Bill, a legal promise to halt biodiversity loss in the UK by 2030, and a proper interpretation of 30 by 30 that means not just that land has a line drawn round it and chosen on a map, but that it's actually managed and protected for communities and for nature. If we can convince our government to go to the table with that, there's a chance that it could seal the deal on a COP15 treaty that goes way beyond the previous two and finally gives us the global framework we need to turn around the state of nature.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's utterly inspiring. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I really hope that listeners have too. And I think my takeaway from you both is that actually the more we can get nature into recovery, the better our chances are of addressing climate and ecological emergencies. But actually to do that, we need stronger, clearer action at all levels, really. What a great interview, what a great co-host. I really hope that you've enjoyed hearing both the passion and the evidence-led views of both Craig and Richard and finding out more about COP15. Don't forget to subscribe to the pod on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode. And I'm really looking forward to sharing the rest of the season with you. So all that leaves me to say is a huge thank you to Craig Bennett and to my wonderful co-host, Richard Benwell. Thank you, Richard. That's it, everyone. Stay safe and we'll see you next time.
Let's Talk WEM is produced by Bwlb. Bwlb Bwlb. The best ideas, the strongest content.